As you probably all know, a recent meta-analysis that was published in the Journal of the American Heart Association raised concerns about paclitaxel devices for the treatment of femoral popliteal disease. In the meantime, we have some updated individual patient analysis that do not show a relationship between paclitaxel dose and mortality. And there's also evidence from real-world data sources like Medicare that did not show any association between mortality and treatment with paclitaxel-coated devices. It all started in 2018 on December 6, when the paper from Katsanos came out, the paclitaxel meta-analysis. After this, a lot of events came on. Several trials were stopped, the SweetPet trials and also the Basel trial. Then there were FDA messages and letters that came out. There were large discussions during LINC already. Papers were published in the meantime. Evaluation by the Viva physicians were done. And then finally, this resulted in a recommencement of the two Swedish trials and also more recently, the Basel trial. I think we need to focus today on what we have learned from the FDA panel that took place the end of June 19 and 20 to be precisely.
Important issue is that the deterministic effect is confirmed or not in paclitaxel and mortality. Well, in science, if you have an adverse event, should be correlated with the dose of the drug you are giving to the patient. Look at this slide. You have on the left the very low paclitaxel dose at in the silver stand. Then you have an intermediate dose with the Lutonix balloon that has 2 micrograms per millimeter square. On the right, you have the Medtronic, is 3.5 micrograms. So it's the so-called high dose. Remember that we used the Taxol for the breast cancer 500 more in dose than for this device. But even this slide, if you see the 5 years mortality for the drug arm of these 3 trials, you would appreciate that the Medtronic balloon has the lower mortality rate. So, and you will see in other slides, there is no deterministic effect. There is no correlation between the dose and the effect, the magnitude of the effect in terms of mortality. This is the 5 years cumulative incidence of mortality for the SFA 1 and 2 IN.PACT trial. We have a mortality of 15%. Remember this number because you will see in the Marianne talk that this, after 5 years, is a low mortality rate for such kind of population. And if you see at the Japan trial, that as well is a randomized trial, IN.PACT versus PTA, there is a 6.6% at 3 years for the PTA and 6% for the drug device for the IN.PACT. Of course, that is not significant, it's not different, and the hazard ratio is 0.97. It's important not just to say if a balloon is giving more effect or is safer than another, but to see if there is a deterministic effect, dose-related effect. Here, they divided in 3 tercile the patient according to the cumulative dose they got during the procedure. So the low tercile, the mid tercile, the intermediate tercile, and the higher tercile. And they compared the mortality rate at 5 years with the PTA. You see in purple the 12% of PTA, and you would appreciate that the lower tercile, so the patient who had less paclitaxel during the procedure had the higher mortality. But even though there is no difference, it's not significant, so it's not related to dose. And I think this is very important. Look here, we divided the SFA2 trial. That means the one they run it in US on the left, in the middle in the Europe, and right is the Japan trial. And this is the follow-up compliance at 5 years or 3 years for the Japan. You will see that at 5 years in US, there is a huge difference in compliance. So patient treated with a PTA, because they have more TLR, they come back to the doctor, and they are better followed, 94% compliance versus 87. Is much lower the delta in Europe, and there is no delta, almost no delta in Japan. Look how this correlate with mortality. When you look at the US mortality, the hazard ratio for DCB is 1.77, and the compliance was much different. If you look at the Japan one, that there was no difference in compliance, patient came back, either if a PTA or DCB, very diligent patient, probably very good trial, at the end mortality is not different. 0.97 is the hazard ratio. So I want to just conclude this first discussion, say there is no drug-related mortality signal in patient-level analysis. There is no evidence for a biological effect. The deterministic effect, the dose relationship is not proved, and probably there are some bias. One could be the follow-up tendency, the follow-up compliance that is very different, especially in the US. Then, of course, is a randomization. These trials are not designed for mortality, and even you have a 2-to-1 randomization. So the population of the PTI arm is very small. Even 1 or 2 events in a small population can change by chance the numbers, so could be a statistical bias or a chance bias. Of course, the updated vital status reduced differences between the two arms, and you have seen in this data that I just presented that there is a very small difference. It is not significant. We need to see and to look to what Marianne will show us in a very large all-comers population registry if this signal is confirmed or not.
We digged into real-world data and tried to see how randomized controlled data can be implemented in the real-world patient cohort, which is the most relevant thing at the end of the day. And we have a bunch of data out there, starting with 5,000 patients, which was the first analysis, and now we're up to 152,000 patients where we have the data which we can analyze. And you see something, and this is the most important thing, then when you start with the lower cohort, and when you look then at the higher number of patients, there is no difference with regard to mortality. So the more patient and the more data you add to this issue with regard to causal relationship in mortality or mortality with regard to DCB coded devices, there is no difference. And this is also something which is coming out of this whole discussion and which has been showed in this analysis which was presented at the FDA panel. It's showing that when you look at non-CLI or CLI patients, regardless the degree of the disease, there is no difference with regard to the device you use. So in non-CLI patients, you have no difference with regard to drug or non-drug treated with regard to mortality. And this is also not the case in CLI. But what this analysis is showing us, it's the severity of the disease which is killing the patients. When you look at the CLI cohort, you have 5 years, a 60% death rate in CLI patients. And I think this is something we have learned out of this whole discussion. First of all, that patients with PAT are really sick patients, and this is the underlying cause for their death. So just let me conclude. The evidence from real-world observation studies Medicare showed no difference midterm or long term with regard to survival between patients treated with drug-coated or non-drug-coated devices. And the observations were similar between device types. It didn't matter if it was drug-coated balloons or drug-eluting stents. And there is no difference in mortality in patients by disease severity with regard to the treatment they got. But there's a difference if they were non-CLI or CLI patients. CLI patients have a higher mortality rate, so the degree of the disease is the reason for death.
Any device in the market that we use on patients should be safe and effective. Well, if we talk about effectiveness, 1 to 5 years is already long term for a patient so complicated as a PAD patient. If you see in this slide, you will see the 3 trials we have so long follow-up. We have a beneficial effect of the drug device versus the PTA. If you look on the slide, you would appreciate that for the silver, the Medtronic is even more than for the other, but still the pooled analysis showed that after 5 years, there is a beneficial effect that is significantly better than the standard PTA. So look at this Kaplan-Meier. This is a Kaplan-Meier with Japanese and ID trial together. You see that 5 years, you have the delta. Of course, there is something could look like a catch-up phenomenon, still is different anyway. But remember 2 things. At that point, people die, you are losing some patients, so it's not that powered for see the primary endpoint of freedom from TLR. But even though you have a significant difference, that means that the difference is high at that level. And then remember that the underlying disease of this patient with PAD is the atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is going on anyway. So disease after 3-4 years is a progression of disease. We should not call hyperplasia, restenosis, but it's progression of the disease. But even though we have a difference, but what is striking in this slide, I think, look, took in your mind the 85% freedom from TLR. If you, as patient, get a PTA after 8 months, 1 day plus 1 day, less than 85% of the total population treated with PTA is free from TLR. The same number, 85%, in the drug-eluting arm, in the drug-eluting balloon-treated arm, you will have 85% of the population free at 3 years. So it's 28 months later. So if you believe in the durability of the treatment, that is very important because patients coming to you because they won't walk. And want you do a treatment and last for the longest period of time they can. Is 8 months, 85% they reach at 8 months. The drug-eluting they reach after 3 years. So it's much different. So this is a conclusion that DCB integrated to standard of care of patient could be a first option treatment for this patient, and is a durable treatment because 85% risk reduction at 1 year, and this benefit is durable over time after 5 years. 3 out of 4 patients treated remained reintervention free at 5 years follow-up. And what I think is very important, we are extending the time of repeat intervention by about 24 months. I think this is very important.
We have evidence from large observational studies that did not show any association between mortality and treatment with paclitaxel-coated devices. What we also have learned from this entire issue and meta-analysis and the observational studies is that actually the mortality in the randomized controlled trials was relatively low, between 10 and 15%, while in real life, the mortality also in claudicants is higher than 30% and even as high as 60% in CLI patients. We know that the IN.PACT RCTs have shown no relationship between paclitaxel exposure and mortality. There is a durable and statistically significant higher patency out to 3 years for the IN.PACT drug-coated balloon, both in the IN.PACT Japan and in the IN.PACT SFA IDE trial. There's no statistically significant difference in mortality observed in these studies at 3 years. There's no identifiable pattern of adverse events to suggest a biological mechanism, and several methods of investigation have demonstrated the absence of a dose relationship to mortality. What we need to do now from here is to perform well-conducted real-world comparative studies that are followed up for a sufficient duration, and I think we need to reset our boundaries from 1 or 2 years up until 5 years in order to be able to understand better the long-term safety of paclitaxel products in the most efficient and timely manner. And with that, I want to conclude this live webinar. I want to thank Marianne Brodmann and Antonio Micari again for their reviews of the data, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.